Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're jumping back into Essential X-Men Volume 7, and we're going to be talking about issues 220 through 224. So, the issues in question were published in 1987 and were written by Chris Claremont and penciled by Marc Silvestri on issues 220 through 222 and 224. And Kerry Gamill stepped in to do the pencils on 223, and Dan Green did the inks for 220 through 223, and Bob Wiacek did the inks on 224. So I'll go ahead and show you all the cover art of the issues in question. So first up, we have a Marc Silvestri cover on issue 220. You got Forge all wrapped up and with nowhere to go and not in a good way. And you got Storm storming in, kind of oblivious to his plight there. And you got 221. Havoc having a rather lousy day. And Wolverine getting caught in the middle. And it's basically a case of power incontinence and forced upon Havoc, and it's not pretty. But Marc Silvestri did the cover art here. Then you have 222, Wolverine and Sabretooth having what looks like a final confrontation, at least if Wolverine has anything to say about it. And another piece by Marc Silvestri. And this particular, artwork was reproduced for this volume's cover. And then we have issue 223 with cover art by Kerry Gamill, and Storm, wrapped up and facing off with a snake demon, which is actually a pretty cool fight in this issue. And you got Naze off in the background, ominously there. And last but not least, we have issue 224. Havoc, putting an end to the brain-dead schemes of a bunch of criminal joyriders, and Longshot saving their, damsel hostage. Definitely fits his character. And it's also by Marc Silvestri. So these particular issues I thought were pretty cool. They did a good job of further developing the team as characters, and we see them actually gelling as a team, albeit under some less than ideal circumstances. But I really think that the arcs of say Wolverine as sort of impromptu team leader, and Storm searching for Forge, make for some rather compelling narratives in and of themselves. And Chris Claremont does a good job of juggling the narratives. And so the main thrust of the story comes from, I guess you could say, those two directions, in a sense that first off you have if we're getting into it, how the story begins. You have Storm, who is looking for Forge, who it was the one who indirectly robbed her of her power by creating a weapon that was initially meant for Rogue, but was accidentally used on her several issues back. And so Storm, as leader of the X-Men, has come to realize that she's very resourceful and a very strong individual, by herself without her powers, but there have been several situations where, frankly, her powers would have come in handy for the team. And plus, she frankly misses flying. She misses being at one with nature, which is a blessing that her powers gave her. And so she makes up her mind to go to Dallas, where Forge's headquarters are at. And before she heads over there, she puts Wolverine in charge of the team. And Wolverine at this point is very unsure of himself, very on edge, because there have been some things that have happened, a few issues back that have rattled his, sense of security and his sense of reality. Namely, he, picked up, the scent of, Jean Grey, who he was, you know, pretty sure was dead. I mean, because he literally, saw her, die along with the rest of the X-Men on the moon during the Dark Phoenix saga. But twice now, he's picked up her scent in different locations, and it's something that has, rattled him. And, you know, and so he is very skeptical of Storm's decision to put him in charge of the team, because if he can't trust his own judgment, I mean, if he's going crazy, then what good is he as a leader? Now he has chosen to, keep this information to himself because, he, you know, can't bring himself to admit that, either Jean Grey is alive or he himself is losing his edge. And he and Storm, recently had occasion to work together, wherein they went up against three super humans from World War II, who, were basically, pulling a most dangerous game routine on, criminals that they found. And, Storm crossed paths with them, along with another criminal, and, Wolverine ended up, coming in at just the right time. But it was right off the heels of having, one of those, breakdowns because of picking up Jean Grey's scent. And so it's really rather shortly after this that, Wolverine is still in a very rocky place, psychologically speaking, but, Storm, not knowing what's going on with Wolverine, she knows her friend's troubled, but she also knows that he's the only one that she can, rely on, to lead the team. And so, because as far as, she's concerned, any other senior member of the X-Men is, basically, unavailable, or, for or they've taken off for, parts unknown. And she doesn't know about, X Factor, or anything like that. She doesn't, know that the original, five members of the X-Men, have become another team altogether, albeit, with different identities, for, say, as for the public, as far as the public is concerned. So Wolverine is basically, the next in line as far as she's concerned. And so Wolverine, after a pep talk from Storm, reluctantly decides to accept the mantle of leadership, while Storm goes to Dallas to, try and, look for Forge and persuade him to find a way to restore her powers. Because if he invented the device that robbed her of her powers, it stands to reason that, he can, create a device that can reverse the effect. And so, Storm, when she gets to Dallas, she finds that Forge's headquarters are in shambles, and she finds like all these holographic projections of, her and Forge, when they were spending time together in his, headquarters, and how they fell in love and came to, bond with one another. But then, the sense of betrayal when, she learned that he was the one who had in fact, created the device that robbed her of her powers, and how he was working with the government to sort of, keep her detained. And so basically, while she's looking for Forge, and she's reliving all this, and she's looking around, she sees that past all the holographic stuff, the place is a mess. I mean, food's rotten, fixtures are falling apart. But she does find his mentor and surrogate father figure, Naze. And, Naze is, telling her that, he was looking for Forge as well. But the thing is, Naze has something shifty going on, and he claims he just arrived there, but he's actually, been in that building for quite some time, um, with, seemingly sinister, purpose. Because one of the last times we saw him, he had, been, confronting, the dire wraiths. This was during like a dire wraith invasion. That was kind of like a crossover with, Rom, the Space Knight, and all that. And he had seemingly been killed by, one of the dire wraiths, and had his form taken. But then something, within, Forge's, headquarters, something of malicious nature, um, killed that particular, dire wraith, that was, stealing Naze's form. And so this malevolent entity has seemingly, taken, Naze's form for itself, but it's masquerading as Naze, and it talks like Naze and everything. So Storm's none the wiser. But, he's telling Storm that, Forge has basically, gone insane. And part of that was because, he was, broken by, his part in Storm's betrayal. And, the fact that, he played a part in, her losing her powers and how devastating it was for her, it's something that he never forgave himself for. Hence why, all these holograms are just replaying that same night over and over again. And at one point, Storm and Naze find, a holographic projection of Forge, in this, throne of, wires, and apparently that was for a time how he was. I mean, that was the state that he had degraded to. But then, he left the building at some point, and Naze is telling Storm that, the two of them had to find him, because, he was raised by his tribe, to be their champion as well as humanity's champion, against, this entity called the adversary. And, the adversary, was this, primordial entity that, basically was chaos personified, and opposed order in all its forms, and was actively, working to cause, the end of the universe, more or less. And it didn't care if the universe died, because, as far as it was concerned, it could just, respawn in a universe that will be reborn from the chaos of it all. And so, Storm, I mean, she and Naze, I mean, they head over to Wyoming because, Forge, has his mountain of power there. And as far as Naze, knows, Forge is actually, working with the adversary, and is, trying to, open the, barriers between reality to allow, um, the adversary and his demonic, forces through. And so, Storm, not knowing that Naze isn't really Naze, agrees to go with him because, Naze makes the point that, if she's wanting any chance of getting her powers back, Forge is the only one who can, you know, return them to her by way of, his, his ability to invent something that'll counteract, the effects of the original device. Um, but at the same time, though, um, he's also pointing out that, with Forge having, gone off the deep end and, joined forces with, the adversary, then basically, Storm's the only one that has a chance of getting through to him because Naze, being, Forge's mentor and father figure and like the one who, taught him, the enchantments of his tribe and everything as a shaman, um, Forge is attuned to Naze's capabilities and has defenses in place, whereas Storm, he's won't be anticipating. And so the two of them, they go to Wyoming, and after Storm's left the X-Men in the care of Wolverine, and they make their way to Forge's Mountain of Power, but it's not an easy trip because at a certain point they have to go by foot. And so they go from, after they left Dallas and arrived in Wyoming, they go on this, quest almost, and, make their way through, this, landscape that, as, they walk on, seems to, be, changing in some ways. And like the landscape starts to look harsher, and, it starts to take on a wintry tone, even though, the time of the season is, far from winter. And they even get attacked by, demonic forces, such as, serpent demons. And Naze is in fact injured by one of these serpent demons, as is Storm. But Naze, being more in tune with, the enchantments, of the supernatural side of things, with, as far as, say, his tribal magic and the adversary is concerned, is far more, gravely affected, by the venom. But, basically, Storm, though, is tasked with, making this remedy, and, to do away with the venom. But Naze is telling her that, it's not for me, it's for you, and, because you're the only one who has a chance, against, Forge. I mean, I'm too badly injured. And yes, this antidote will help me, but you need it. And, in order to be able to, make it to Forge's Mountain of Power. And so um, she drinks the potion, and ends up being attacked by all these demonic manifestations, including that seemingly of Forge himself, um, and it nearly kills her. But through sheer force of will, she powers through it, and when she comes to, she realizes that she's still in the cabin, and the antidote was something that not only cured her of the poison, um, as well as Naze, but it also took her on a vision quest. And so basically, this was Naze, you know setting things up to where Storm was tested, and to see that she was, whether or not she was ready to make the ascent to Forge's Mountain of Power. And her having survived this, I mean, not only is the poison removed from her body, as she and Naze have both recovered from the full effects of the poison, but Naze is still incapacitated. So and plus the fact that Forge and his defenses are actively attuned against Naze. And so, he's sends Storm off, to confront Forge. But he, but they actually share a farewell kiss, because, they've gotten to sort of, bond with each other over this experience. And, they, neither of them knows if, Storm's going to be coming back. And, Storm's kind of gotten to become fond of Naze, because, he's, got this, sort of demeanor about him, to where it's like, I mean, she sees a lot of where Forge came from in him. But as, she, heads to the mountain, though, Naze, makes it even clearer, once she's gone, that he isn't really Naze and is actively anticipating the outcome of the event. Whether Storm kills Forge or Forge kills Storm. He just wants to he doesn't care what happens as long as chaos ensues. And so Storm is able to make it to Storm's mountain to Forge's mountain of power, albeit after slaughtering her way through an army of demons that are breaking through the barriers between reality that the adversary is trying to get through. And at this point, bear in mind, Storm does not have her powers and is fighting tooth and nail and using a knife to fight back against these demons. And something that does work to her advantage, though, is the fact that the barrier isn't fully opened yet. So these demons are able to get through, but below a certain point of the mountain, they are not able to fully manifest. Like, they're almost like phantoms, but closer to the top of the mountain, they're fully physical. And so Storm was able to slaughter her way through them, but make no mistake, I mean, she got sliced up pretty good as well. But she gets to the mountain, though, to the very top, and she sees Forge and working his magic on the barrier. But when she calls out to him, I mean, he turns around and he's clearly surprised to see her, but he's also happy. But then she stabs him, though. And bear in mind, at this point, she's thinking that Forge is, like Naze had told her, working with the adversary and had gone rogue and is basically thrown his lot in with the forces of darkness. And once she stabs Forge, she begs his forgiveness, but basically it was necessary to stop him from opening the barriers between reality for the adversary. And Forge, as he's near mortally wounded, is gasping and trying to tell her that you got it all wrong. And finally he's able to choke out that he wasn't trying to open the barriers, he was trying to close them. And that's when Storm realizes that she's been tricked, and they both have. And so that's when upon this realization, Naze, reveals himself, to be the adversary, and it starts to snow, and so with that plot thread, we end up switching over to another one, and Storm, having left the X-Men in the care of Wolverine, they end up getting into a mix-up with the Marauders once more. So this is X-Men versus Marauders round 2, except with a different roster of characters in the team. But the reason they end up getting into it with the Marauders is because they get a call from Madelyn Pryor, who had been in the hospital after and catatonic after the Marauders had previously tried to kill her, but somehow she was able to survive. Like, she had been mortally wounded by way of gunshot wounds, but then for some mysterious reason her body started to heal on its own, and not to a point where she was 100% healed, but to where she was out of danger. And it stunned the doctors for sure. But when she told them who she was, they couldn't find any record of her. And so she's freaking out because there's no record of her existence. And her husband, Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, the last she saw of him, he was walking out on her and her son Nathan, without giving any sort of explanation. And then, she finds out that, her son's missing, and so, she doesn't know what's going on. I mean, she doesn't know, why the Marauders, took her son, and she doesn't know why they tried to kill her. And so she's finally able to, get through, to the X-Men, because any attempt to, call, say, anyone else that she might have known is, fruitless, or the results are fruitless. And it's like someone's out to, erase her. And so, but she's finally able to get a call through, to the X-Men from the hospital. And, Wolverine, it lets the X-Men know, it's like, okay, we're going to, the hospital where Madelyn Pryor's at, but someone's, tried to kill her. And she says it's the Marauders. And so, those who, were in conflict with the Marauders and during the Mutant Massacre, wherein the majority of the Morlocks were slaughtered, they remember the Marauders. And, the newcomers to the team are, caught up on, current events as far as that goes. And so, they, come to realize that, with Madelyn Pryor having, come to in the hospital, it stands to reason that the Marauders are going to try again to take her out. And sure enough, it turns out that they are. And this is where we learn who their master is. And this is where Mr. Sinister makes his first appearance. And Mr. Sinister, of course, would go on to become a well-known X-Men villain. But here, I mean, he makes his first appearance and reveals himself to be the one not only behind the Mutant Massacre, but the one behind the erasure of, more Madelyn Pryor's, life. And one of the things that, he's, furious about is the fact that, he's devoted a full-scale operation to, erasing Madelyn Pryor's life and every trace of it, her existence, and yet the Marauders, couldn't kill, a simple woman. And so, the Marauders are like, okay, we'll try again. She got lucky somehow. And so they go to the hospital in San Francisco where she's at, which is where the X-Men are trying to, basically, keep an eye out for the Marauders, and Psylocke, being the telepath of the team, gets a lock on them. And so, unfortunately, they're not able to stop the Marauders from killing, a good portion of the hospital staff, but they are able to prevent them from, killing Madelyn Pryor. And so, the Marauders and the X-Men, they mix it up, and both sides get some good hits in, and Madelyn Pryor though is seemingly thrown to her death off the Golden Gate Bridge and seemingly drowns. But thanks to Longshot, she ends up being saved. And it was an instance of basically during the fight, he fell in the right place at the right time and was able to get there in time to keep her from drowning. But during the fight though, I mean, both sides, put up a good fight. But unfortunately, though, the Marauders get away before the X-Men can, get a lock on them, as far as, say, being able to, chase them down. But on the bright side, though, they, as far as, the Marauders are concerned, as far as they know, Madelyn Pryor's dead, and their objective is complete. And so, Wolverine is pointing out that even though, they weren't able to defeat the Marauders this time, then they were able to, save Madelyn Pryor's life. And the Marauders don't know that she's still alive. And so basically, they've they bring her into the team, and to basically just kind of protect her and keep an eye on her, and try and find out what's going on, why they're after her. But there are some benefits, that, come with, Madelyn Pryor being a part of the team. One of which is she's a qualified pilot. And so, the, plane they use, is now, being flown by someone other than Rogue, who, I mean, she can fly and everything, but some of her knowledge was basically, absorbed through, you know, other pilots, when she, touched them and what have you. But as far as, Madelyn Pryor goes, I mean, she's a full-on pilot, and so that's something that they appreciate and everything. And plus, I mean, the ones who do know her, I mean, are, glad to, have her, as, a part of the, team. Um, but unfortunately, though, even though they're able to save her life, um, they're not able to, fill, the, hole, that is in her heart, because, as far as she is concerned, her husband left her high and dry and wasn't there to protect her. And so Alex Summers, aka Havoc, Cyclops' brother, actually ends up, bonding with her, because, both of them have, become separated from the ones that, they loved. And namely, with Havoc, his, wife, Lorna Dane, aka Polaris, was actually taken over by a marauder named Malice, who was basically a body swapping, entity, who had caused all sorts of havoc for the X-Men a few issues back, namely by, making, Dazzler go crazy, and which is basically how she ended up being with the X-Men, because of the fallout from, Malice's, possession of her. Um, but then, with her having taken over Polaris, during the fight, with the Marauders, Havoc, was put in a position where, he had to make a decision, to use his, blasts on her, to, take her out, or let her go, knowing that, Malice in, Lorna's body was going to, go on to kill more people. And so, Havoc, in desperation and with a broken heart, used his, power to try and, kill, the woman he loved, but knowing that it wasn't her, running the show, but, it was kind of a do or die situation. And Malice, though, in Lorna's body, was able to, survive the blast, and, taunts, Havoc, with the fact that, when push came to shove, I mean, it was a tough situation either way, but when push came to shove, he chose to kill the woman he loved. And so, with, Malice, flying off, in Lorna's body and taunting Havoc with that, I mean, that was something that rattled him. And so even though, I mean, they all survived the fight and everything, I mean, Havoc's, dealing with the fact that, the woman he loved is, you know, taken away from him and is not in control of herself. And so, when he finds Madelyn Pryor possibly about to commit suicide by jumping off a cliff, he, goes up to her and is able to talk her down by, sharing his own sense of grief and loss. And so, the two of them actually, begin to bond over their shared, pain. And so that's where we see, Alex, Summers and Madelyn Pryor begin to form something of a relationship, and it kind of starts here. But all in all, though, I thought that, both plot threads were, very well done. Sorry, before I get into a review, something else I need to mention. In regards to the plot thread of the X-Men, the Marauders, one of the fallouts from that battle on the Golden Gate Bridge is the fact that the government, represented by Valerie Cooper, has authorized Freedom Force to apprehend the X-Men. And so the Freedom Force is a group of former criminals, namely the Brotherhood of Mutants, that is working for the government. And so basically, the government sends them to go after someone or do some dirty work, and they succeed in the mission and eventually are pardoned by the government. So you have Mystique, Destiny, Avalanche, Pyro, and the Blob. And at this point, they're joined by the three World War II superhumans that Storm and Wolverine had gone up against a few issues back, namely Stonewall, Crimson Commando, and Super Saber. And so with the three of them on the team, the Freedom Force is bound to become a more potent threat. But their eagerness to go up against the X-Men once more and defeat them this time is dampened when Destiny, who's a blind precog, gets these flashes of the future that the X-Men will die in Dallas. And so with that in mind, Mystique, the reason that Destiny was able to get these flashes of the future was because her and Mystique were the foster parents of Rogue, before she joined the X-Men. And so from time to time, Destiny would look in on Rogue to see if she can see her future, see how she's doing, and she lets Mystique know, because she knows that even though they're on opposite sides of the law, or opposite ends of morality, I mean, good and evil and everything, that Mystique still considers Rogue her daughter, and Rogue still considers Mystique her mom. And so but when she got this flash, though, I mean, it was basically screaming at her that this is the future. If the X-Men are going to be in Dallas, and they're going to die in Dallas very soon. And so Mystique actually goes to Rogue, albeit in disguise, and then she reveals herself and tells Rogue that the reason that she's there is to try and get her to come home, or home, if you will, because the fact that because of what Destiny saw, that the X-Men die in Dallas very soon. But she's saying that if Rogue isn't there with them, then she won't share their future. And so Rogue, I mean, she knows that when Destiny sees something ominous, it's something to take seriously. And so she appreciates Mystique warning her, but she refuses to bail on her friends, her new family, the X-Men. And so Mystique leaves brokenhearted and heads back to Freedom Force, albeit with even more determination to apprehend the X-Men prior to them going to Dallas, because while she does have a score to settle with the X-Men, her and the rest of Freedom Force, she is even more desperate to save her foster daughter. So that was another detail I neglected to mention. But yeah, okay. So all in all, though, these 4 issues, I thought were very well done. I'm sorry, these issues were very well done, and I think that Chris Claremont continues to do a good job of, developing the characters, and I like how, he took two different plot threads and, basically made it to where it's like there's a separate sense of development for both plot threads and the characters, in them, but he makes it very clear that they're going to converge very soon. And so, with the revelation that Naze is in fact the adversary, and Forge having his headquarters in Dallas, I mean, and the adversary having masqueraded as Naze all this time has made his headquarters, in Forge's place. Not the amount of power, mind you, but the building in Dallas that Forge resides in. Naze has been there, or I should say, the adversary as Naze has been there this whole time, basically tapping into, the, magic and the sorcery, that, Forge was attuned to, and just basically, making a foothold. And, once, Storm has mortally wounded Forge, under, Naze, the adversary's manipulation, and lies, I mean, the barriers between reality are now thrown open. And so, so this whole, premonition, that the X-Men are going to die in Dallas looks like it's going to happen, and, things aren't looking so good. And so I like how there's this, sense of, foreboding that's just building up and building up. Because on one hand, you have, prior to Naze being revealed to be the adversary, in disguise, I mean, we know that, something is wrong, was going on with Forge, or we know that there was manipulation going on some level, but we didn't know for sure, just how much, Naze was doing the manipulating, and or how much Forge was doing the manipulating, until we come to realize that, Forge was, never, throwing in his lot in with the forces of darkness. I mean, he may have been heartbroken, by, his by, the fallout of, his and Storm's romance, souring, but he was never going to turn traitor, though. He was never going to turn against humanity. And, he was, still, even though he had, tried to live separately from his tribe, he was still committed against, fight against the adversary. But, we only find that out at the end, though. And we don't know that Naze is the adversary until the very end. We just know that, Naze isn't Naze. But then again, maybe that whoever or whatever this is telling the truth to Storm to suit its own purposes, only to find out that, I mean, there may have been some truth mixed in, but it's all revealed to be, the adversary pulling the strings all along. And on the other side of things, we have, Mr. Sinister, finally you're revealing himself and basically showing that, he too is skilled at manipulation, namely at erasing the life of an innocent woman. And, the horror of Madelyn Pryor's situation is very immediate because, as far as we know, I mean, this is an ordinary woman, albeit a strong-willed one, whose life has been turned upside down, almost overnight, at least as far as her perspective is concerned, because, I mean, suddenly, these, people are trying to kill her. She can't find her husband, and, her, who, last she saw, basically abandoned her, and she doesn't know what happened to her son, and everyone that she knew, is suddenly no longer in existence except for the X-Men. And so, yeah, like whenever, the narrative, focuses on her perspective, I mean, there's a very human element there. I mean, there's a human element with all the, the characters. I mean, even though they're mutants and everything, that's what makes them such you know important characters within the Marvel universe. I mean, even with their powers, they're still very human. But Madelyn Pryor, at least as far as we know at this point, I mean, is human. I mean, and her struggle feels very real. And so when her and Havoc, have that heart to heart with one another, I mean, it felt real because, I mean, they've both been through, their lives being turned upside down, their loved ones being taken from them. And one of the things I liked about, these issues is that you see all the characters continue to evolve. And I like how Havoc, I mean, he's gone from being a former, semi-founding member of the team, to then, being a newbie to the team, and a rather unwelcome one at least initially. But he's gradually becoming a part of the team and learning to you know learning to be a part of it and vibe with them, and basically learning to function as one of them, as opposed to say him trying to take charge and you know solve everything on his own like he was prone to do prior to him joining the team. But I also liked how in regards to Dazzler, you have her still trying to cope with the fact that she no longer has the world as her stage, because she was a singer, and she used her light and sound powers to augment her shows and everything. But then what with the public turning anti-mutant and her being revealed to be a mutant, I mean, her career is over. And so what with also Malice having possessed her, I mean, she's had to go with the X-Men out of necessity. And so I liked how she's still at odds with some of them, like say Rogue, because the two of them had clashed more than once prior to both of them being X-Men. But she's learning to be part of the team as well. Like, she's learning to work for the good of the team. But she does have moments where her individuality, her desire to stay in the spotlight does draw unwanted attention to the team. And Wolverine's having to sort of set her to rights and tell her that, hey, I get where you're coming from, but you can't be the prima donna that you used to be, because it's not just you this time that's on the line, it's all of us. And so even though they're in San Francisco and the population there is more tolerant of the X-Men and sees them as legitimate heroes, I mean, there's still humanity to contend with. And so public sentiment can turn at the drop of a hat. And so Wolverine's having to lecture her and say, hey, you can't be doing this, you gotta be careful. But also I liked how Longshot, I mean, even though he's not made to be like, say, the star of the book, I do like how there is this sense that if he hadn't been a part of the team, then the good luck that is literally a part of him would not have benefited the team in the way that it had. I mean, for example, I mean, without him, it's very possible that Madelyn Pryor would have drowned, or it's even possible that the X-Men wouldn't have been able to have saved Madelyn Pryor prior to them getting to the hospital. And so just little things like that. And that's something I appreciate about the writing and everything, is how Chris Claremont, I mean, he shows how each team member, when they use their powers, there's like a conscious effort to use them and in their actions and everything. But when it comes to Longshot, though, I mean, he's not necessarily trying to use his power. It just it's a part of him. The good luck. It's literally a part of him. I mean, hell, when he and Rogue and Psylocke and Dazzler went up against Juggernaut in Scotland. I mean, you know, if he hadn't been there, it's very possible that the three of them would have been annihilated by Juggernaut, and there would have been a rather large loss of civilian life as well. Because I mean, we're talking about a foe that the X-Men in their entirety couldn't defeat, and so with Longshot there, I mean, and him working with those other three, you know there was a lot of luck involved in defeating Juggernaut, and so, and even, heck, even his involvement in the stories where they went up against that the alien horde, the one who kidnapped them back in the that one annual. I mean, his involvement there, basically gave them a fighting chance because he was absorbed into this, alien, fortress or that was basically confronting the X-Men with their heart's desires. And, him being absorbed into a fortress, you get the idea it made it structurally weaker for them to break through the walls and get closer to their objective. And like in the Fantastic Four versus the X-Men miniseries, you get the idea that his, luck power, kicked in, and, basically he ended up saving, someone who, granted, turned out to be a robotic minion of Doctor Doom. But if he hadn't have done that, then the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, never would have gotten together in the first place, and Kitty Pryde, in turn, would not have had her life saved. And so just all these little things that are coming into play, I mean, seemingly from, long shot, just, him and his luck power being at the right place at the right time. Um, because, I mean, amongst other things, I mean, he's literally able to save Madelyn Pryor because, he falls in, near the same spot where she's drowning. And so, had he not been there, the Marauders may very well have succeeded in their objective. So, um, so I like how Chris Claremont, and the creative team continue to show that even though he's not the star of the team, I mean he definitely has a vital part to play, and yeah, in the fact that they've had a run of good luck, literally. So there you go. Um, I will say though that in all this, I do miss Magneto's presence because in the X-Men versus the Fantastic Four versus the X-Men miniseries, he was a vital part of the story, and he was very well written, and I liked seeing his continued development into, say, someone, a former villain who's trying to atone for his actions and fight for the side of good and be a genuine hero. And in that particular miniseries, I mean, I thought they did a good job of showing that Magneto is a hero now. But unfortunately, his presence is missed here. And to be fair, that's mainly, I believe, because he was most of his attention was taken up by being the headmaster of the school for the New Mutants back in their comic book, as well as, say, his activities with joining up with the Hellfire Club, like the Hellfire Club and the X-Men forming an alliance. But mostly, though, if I remember correctly, at this point in time, Magneto was mostly, found in the New Mutants series. And so, like, he would pop up in the X-Men series here and there, and he'd have some memorable, he would definitely have memorable moments and a vital part to play. But it's just that, he becomes, such a welcome presence that when he's not there, he's missed. And so, I kind of wonder how, I mean, with respect to Storm and Wolverine, who are both good leaders in their own right, I wonder how things might have transpired had Magneto been, present in this story. And say if, Storm, was, wanting to still, pursue Forge to, get her powers back. I mean, maybe if she had talked to him instead of Wolverine, or maybe if she had talked to both him and Wolverine, maybe they could have, come up with some, plans that would have maybe, prevented Storm from falling into, the adversary's trap. I mean, granted, they don't know about the adversary, but with Magneto and his wisdom, I mean, maybe they could have come up with something different to where it's like the adversary. I mean, maybe, Storm would have, fallen to the adversary's, trap, one way or another. But at the very least, I don't know. I get the feeling that Magneto would have, counseled, caution. Like he would have insisted on someone going with her, um, considering the nature of the situation. Um, but but yeah, I mean, just that's the one thing I could think of that um, I thought was kind of a like it's still a great set of stories. It's still a great set of issues. It's just that when Magneto was such a memorable part of the storyline that was prior to this one, and he's not anywhere in this particular storyline. I mean, it his presence is missed. So, um, and I will say that with Mister Sinister finally making his appearance, um, in universe, I mean, it's a pretty scary moment and everything. And, seeing Mr. Sinister, how he appeared for the first time, I mean, you know, his schemes, come to be revealed later on um, in the series, and not that far into the series, as a matter of fact, fairly soon. But it's with his involvement, though, that the character of Madelyn Pryor will soon, take a direction that, will prove to be very divisive. And I can definitely, see why it was divisive. And I'll definitely be getting into that, once I get into those stories. But I will say that knowing what happens later on, it's kind of like, I'm on the outside looking in and I'm knowing what's going to happen to Madelyn Pryor, and I feel so sorry for her, I mean, because with all this crap that's happening to her, I mean, you feel sorry for her as a character, but then again, at this point, at least in the stories in this volume, I mean, Madelyn Pryor, I mean, she was saved by the X-Men and she's welcomed by them. Granted, it's out of, necessity, for her own safety and everything. But, she's lost one family, her husband Scott and her son Nathan. But in dire circumstances, though, she's gained a new one. So there is something heartwarming in that regard, in the sense that, these are, people that, she, knows and cares about, and vice versa. And so the X-Men, they consider Madeline to be one of them by default. And so, they don't know, why Scott ran out on her. They don't know why the Marauders are trying to kill her, but all they know is that, someone that they care about is in danger and she needs help. And so, you know, they welcome her with open arms. And, her having a, budding, you know, relationship, or it starts off as a friendship but it does become somewhat of a relationship with Havoc, is heartwarming as well, because you have two people who experienced loss in a different way, and but they both you know understand each other's pain. And so, excuse me, so I liked, even though I know what happens down the road with her, as far as this volume is concerned, I do like the fact that, at least within these issues that I'm reviewing, there is a seeming there does seem to be a silver lining for her character. So basically, if I was reading this book and I don't know anything about what happens after the issues in this volume, um, I mean, I would say that as far as what I'm seeing of Madelyn Pryor, I mean, she's got some much needed hope. What with her being taken in by the X-Men. Um, so it's very strange because I'm trying to judge this as someone who, you know, from the perspective of someone who's reading this for the first time, even though I've read beyond the stories in this volume. So judging it on the merits of, say, looking at it from the first time, Madeline does seem to have some hope you know that came out of a dire situation. So judging in that regard, I mean, I think that she's a welcome addition to the team, and and I really wish that that dynamic had been kept up as opposed to, say, what happened later on. But for the time being, though, the X-Men, with Madelyn Pryor, on board, I mean, it's definitely something that's a positive direction for the series. And I also liked Rogue and how she's fully loyal to the X-Men at this point, but she does still have some loyalties to her foster mother Mystique, as well as Destiny by default, because the two of them raised her. And I liked how even though the X-Men, the Freedom Force, have clashed, um, I like how Mystique and Rogue, they see each other as family first, as opposed to, say, enemies. Even though their teams are enemies, but it's like when they see each other, and when Mystique reveals herself to Rogue, and why she's there and everything, Rogue doesn't call the X-Men on her. I mean, she does tell them that Mystique talked to her and tried to warn her about them all dying in Dallas in the very near future, but she doesn't say, hey, Mystique's here, we need to take her out, or anything like that. I like how she sees Mystique as her mom, and loves her as such. And same with Mystique. I mean, even though she does go all in on but having Freedom Force go along with Valerie Cooper's agenda and apprehending the X-Men, I think that Mystique, I mean, she has her own reasons for doing so. She's doing so because the first attempt to get Rogue to leave the team failed. And so now she's trying to do so through force, but at the end of the day, she's trying to save the woman that is the daughter that she more or less raised. And so I liked seeing that family dynamic. So you have the family dynamic with the X-Men, and you have the family dynamic between Mystique and Rogue. And also liked seeing how the three World War II superhumans butt heads with the other members of Freedom Force, and how their personalities definitely clashed, but it was an interesting mix of perspectives, because you had the World War II generation mindset versus these up-jumped thugs who are now in a position of authority. So there you go. But I do think, though, that as far as Storm is concerned, I think that I really like her continuing development, and we definitely see why she is the de facto leader of the team at this point. I mean, yeah, Magneto is the head of Xavier's school, but Storm's the leader of the X-Men. So, and so when she chooses Wolverine, I mean, she's able to get through to him that hey, you're the only one I trust for this gig. And so Wolverine's come to see that Storm is, the best qualified to be a leader at this point. And so when she's saying that, that he's next in line, he's like, hey, I don't want to do it, but if you're saying I'm the best one for the job, okay, I'll do it. So I like their, dynamic. They're, even though that you only see them together in the first, issue of these issues that I'm reviewing right now. But I also like how you see her mindset, in terms of, say, she goes from, loving Forge to hating him and back again. Um, and even her dynamic with Naze was, fascinating as well, because, her and Naze, the real Naze, I mean, they, had a, certain, forged in fire camaraderie with one another. And so the adversary masquerading as Naze is able to tap into that and basically, manipulate Forge, to a T. I mean, sorry, manipulate Storm to a T. Probably Forge too, but he's able to tap into like Naze's memories and everything, and so he's able to talk to her as Naze, like Naze would talk to her. And so there are moments where you almost forget that it's not Naze. Like, you may not know that it's the adversary, but you know that it's not Naze. But then again, whoever's masquerading as Naze is doing a very good job of imitating him, to the point where, there are moments where, we're almost fooled. And so, in a sense that there are moments where her and Naze, fight back to back with one another against like some of the demonic forces that, end up being some of the adversary's own forces. But then I guess it's just a sign on one hand of good writing, in a sense that, we were lulled into a moment of blissful forgetfulness that this wasn't Naze that was with Storm, and that, it's almost like two old soldiers, bantering with one another. But then again, that makes, the gut punch of, Naze being the adversary that much more painful, because Naze, in the relatively brief amount of time that we, initially knew him, prior to him being, killed by, one of the dire wraiths, was a very likable character, and he and Storm had a very good camaraderie with one another. And so the fact that, the adversary was able to imitate him to such perfection, speaks to just how powerful, the adversary is, and that's just a portion of his power. But I like seeing, Storm's, development, as far as, say, her commitment to ending the threat of the adversary, by killing Forge, even though she, loves him, only to find out that, he was trying to stop the adversary all along. And so, I do think that it's fascinating how, even though in this, these issues, the majority of, the spotlight is on Storm, and most of the character development is on Storm, but we do get some, indirect character development with Forge as well, albeit through the holographic projections, that are found throughout his ruined, headquarters. Because on one hand, we're reliving, the life-death story that was beautifully illustrated by Barry Windsor Smith, where when Forge and Storm, became romantically involved, only to have a, harsh falling out. So we're reliving that, and, being reminded of, their romance, and, Forge is further developed. But then we have that, tragic moment where, we see that holographic projection of Forge, and he's disheveled, and he looks, sick, and he's like, on this throne, tied up to all these, cords and wires and everything. And initially we're thinking that's really him, but it's another hologram. But if, the adversary as Naze is being truthful, that was, how Forge was for a time because of how devastated he was at, hurting Storm, the woman he loved. And so we definitely, get some character development from him in that regard, in the sense that we saw that this was a guy with a, broken heart, and it nearly killed him, so, um, but I guess one thing I will say is that, like, the fight between the X-Men and the Marauders was really cool, and I liked seeing how, you know both sides put up a good fight. Um, and I guess you could argue that the Marauders won in, a strictly, beatdown sense, but the X-Men won in a tactical sense, in that they rescued Madelyn Pryor. But there is a point where, Wolverine, you know nearly kills Sabretooth. In fact, he stabs him in what looks like the heart. And at that point, you know, it's kind of like, okay, Wolverine even says aloud that Sabretooth has a healing factor. But if I remember correctly, at that point, when after he stabbed Sabretooth, he, was, trying to, get to someone else. He was trying to, rescue someone or something like that. But he basically was hoping that, it would be enough for, Sabretooth's healing factor to be delayed, that kind of thing. But at that point, I'm kind of like, why don't you just kill him? I mean, yeah, that would be enough to kill, like, a normal person, but this is Sabretooth. If you know he's got a healing factor, dude, just use your claws and take his head off. I mean, because basically that happens in, the issue that this was the original cover art for. And it's an awesome moment, you're like, yes, because Sabretooth is, just a complete monster, as are the rest of the Marauders. And so anytime, they get, some, beatings handed to them by the X-Men, I mean, it's a moment of rejoicing. But when it comes to Wolverine and Sabretooth, though, I felt like that was just kind of like, in universe, it felt like a tactical blunder on Wolverine's part. Like, that could have been a moment where he's like, okay, the Marauders are clearly, out to kill. And Storm even, said during the Mutant Massacre storyline that when it comes to the Marauders, the X-Men, are allowed to kill them if it comes down to it. And so, just out of necessity because of how dangerous they are. And so at that point, I just felt like, Wolverine, having had the prior experience of having fought both Sabretooth in the past, and then more recently the Marauders, and experienced, the trauma of, the Mutant Massacre and, the near massacre of the Morlocks. I mean, at that point, I felt like, Wolverine should have just gone full-on soldier mode and just hacked Sabretooth's head off, because that would have taken, that would have robbed the Marauders of a, vital resource in terms of, say, sheer savagery, because Sabretooth was arguably the most savage member of the team in terms of all-out ferocity. But, or ferocity, however you say it. Sorry, but I think, like, in universe, I feel like it was a tactical blunder on Wolverine's part to not, just decapitate Sabretooth right then and there. But I think, behind the scenes, the bigwigs at Marvel, or maybe the creative team even, might have been like, okay, Sabretooth's too popular of a villain to, just kill, so we'll have him, beat up pretty good, but we're not going to kill him. He's just, the readers love him, that kind of thing. And it was true, readers loved him, and Sabretooth is a popular villain to this day. But just looking at things from the perspective of, in universe, you're up against a team of supervillains that, nearly killed you last time, and makes it clear that they're going to kill you if they meet again. At that point, the kid gloves should come off, and you should do whatever it takes to defend yourself, even if it means killing them. I mean, that's my stance on it. That's where I'm kind of like more, say, Frank Castle than Peter Parker, you know. But in terms of morality there. But but yeah, other than that, you know, tactical blunder, I feel like, you know, it was a good, you know, fight scene, and you know, it was a good battle, and it was believable in the sense of, you know, how it went down. But yeah, so all in all, though, I'm gonna go ahead and give, you know, these issues, you know, 5 out of 5 stars. You know, these were good, and did a good job of continuing to develop, you know, certain plot threads, and also introducing us to new ones. And so, but yeah, I'll show you some of the artwork just real quick. You know, not all the artwork, but you know, just enough. So you got this opening sequence here, Marc Silvestri art. And I like how, you know, it goes, you know, from, you know, beautiful and serene with the birds to like a nightmare, you know, with like a foreshadowing of the bird, one of the birds turning into like this bionic creature, symbolizing Forge being a cyborg, and, you know, robbing Storm of her ability to fly. And let's see. Oh yeah. Like right here, and this is when, you know, Storm makes her way into Forge's headquarters and being confronted by all the holograms. And these are all holograms, you know, based on Forge's, you know, thoughts of Storm. And then that's when she finds the hologram of him with all the wires. And here she is with Naze. And mind you, at this point, obviously it's not Naze, but it's the adversary in disguise. But we don't know it's the adversary yet. Then, like right here, this is one of the moments where, you know, Rogue and, you know, Dazzler are at odds with one another, because, you know, Dazzler was, you know, using, you know, the Danger Room to, you know, have, you know, Rogue as an opponent. And Rogue's like, what the hell are you doing having me as an opponent? We're on the same side now, you know? But Marc Silvestri was really good at, you know, showcasing Dazzler's powers, I thought. The lighting and everything. And here's, you know, Naze, you know, the adversary as Naze, you know, using his, you know, sorcery to create these demons. Let's see. And there's Malice in possession of, you know, Polaris. And here's Storm and Naze facing off with some of the demons. And right here, you know, this is during the battle between them with the Marauders, but I thought this was a nice little long shot moment. Scalp Hunter, taking aim, and then, Long Shot, gets in his sights. And I liked how, he chose just the right moment to do so, because Scalp Hunter was about to take a shot that probably would have killed even Rogue. But, Long Shot, having, become fond of Rogue, I guess showed up at just the right moment, so it's like on a subconscious level, who knows, luck power, right? But I like how, he's just hanging there like a little kid, distracting, Scalp Hunter and, allowing Wolverine to be able to yank him up. Right. And this is, shortly after Malice, in Lorna's body, forced Havoc to, shoot her. But there she is, taunting him about it. Havoc's not having a good day. And I love this, page by Kerry Gamill. And this is when you don't see him come in yet, but this is the issue where all three of the World War II superhumans joined Freedom Forces, Crimson Commando and Stonewall, and Super Saber joins them, shortly. I forgot to mention another member of Freedom Force was Spiral from Mojo World, same place that Longshot comes from. But I tend to forget that she was a part of Freedom Force sometimes. But speaking of which, there she is, apprehending Super Saber, the speedster. But and here are the X-Men training. And at this point, they're using Alcatraz, as a sort of makeshift headquarters. But you got Rogue. Sorry for the noise. Kids, not mine. But then you got Psylocke, with her, telepathy being displayed. Because anytime she uses her powers, there's like this butterfly effect, the eyes and the wings right there. I always thought that was pretty cool. Let's see, right here, got Dazzler and Longshot sparring with one another. And here's a fight scene, between Storm and the Snake, one of the Snake demons. And I don't know how you can see it here, but she's literally taken out its eye right there. But and this is when Havoc or Alex, is talking to Madelyn, and the two of them end up getting close with one another, bonding through their shared pain. So. And here's where, Mystique, reveals herself to Rogue and, tries to get her to come with her. You see, shape-shifting. There's Storm climbing up, to Forge's mountain of power. but got an army of demons coming at her. There she is putting up a fight against them. Pretty cool shot. And then there's the vital moment. Face to face with Forge. And then she stabs him. But yeah, so that was X-Men 220 through 224. Good set of stories. And if you made it this far, thank you very much for taking the time to go along on this ride with me. And thanks for tuning in. And if you like what we see here, feel free to like and subscribe. If you got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. Y'all take care. Have a good night. Bye.